is be selfish.
No, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. You said human nature is basically being selfish.
I said human nature is influenced by this single line of code that says be selfish, and the evidence would seem to suggest that that is the case.
I'll say opposite to that. Human beings have been on this earth for about 1 million years.
Right.
1 million years. For the last 13,000 years, which is just a blip, they've been organised into very, very selfish societies because the agricultural revolution, which occurred about 13,000 years ago, human beings settled in one spot, cultivated that spot, and then had to defend that spot from other human beings.
Can you point to a society that doesn't have innate selfishness?
Yes, all of the society before that point was a communalistic society of hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers.
Those communities were in conflict with one another.
They were.
Yes, they were.
No, you're talking about tribal society.
You have.
No, I'm talking pre-tribal society.
What is your evidence?
The evidence, if you just study.
Yeah, but the point is, from what I've seen of that, human nature, those groups competed.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they did.
No, they didn't.
Over hunting grounds, over resources, because human nature, by nature, wishes to look after itself and its own.
Believe that.
It's not just what. Go on.
This was the case when human beings converted into tribal societies when they fought each other. However, before that, human beings started off in Eastern Africa as just one species in that very one spot. They then expanded, reproduced, and moved throughout the area. And there was so much food and hunting possibilities, there was no conflict between one human species.
There's no evidence of that at all.
Well, there is, because there was no evidence to not that. Because there was plenty of everything. There was plenty of food, there was plenty of...
But that doesn't work like that.
It does work like that.
No, I mean, the thing is, sorry, one second. Because the thing is, if we look at the human condition, if we look at the way that humans behave, human beings have consistently demonstrated a tendency to themselves. Even geneticists call it the selfish gene.
No.
So they don't call it the selfish gene.
You're quoting Dawkins.
Yeah, and
he had wrote a book called The Selfish Gene.
And he's a biologist, isn't he?
But you misinterpreted what he was saying.
Well, so what?
The human gene, the selfish human gene, is the basis within this body to defend itself.
There you go.
But it's not defending itself against another human being. Because another human being, you need another human being to survive. Human beings have to have other human beings.
But outside of a certain collective, other human beings, this is your claims. These are just your claims.
Study anthropology.
But the point is, my study of anthropology, because you're not the only person that studied anthropology in this conversation, my study of anthropology leads me to no other conclusion than the fact that you can trace out a golden thread in human nature that is corrupting and corruptible based upon that innate selfishness.
You're quoting anthropology that's studying...
You can just use the handle.
You're quoting... You're quoting anthropology that's studying tribal society, post-agricultural society. You're absolutely right. You're right. But before that instance, 13,000 years ago, human beings, it was in their interest to cooperate. It was in their interest to cooperate.
Within groups?
No. Within groups, everyone was in groups. There were no
But those groups were in competition.
No, they weren't.
They were.
No,
they were in competition.
You've got a forest, a huge forest, full of food and fruits and vegetables and animals that you can hunt, and there's plenty of everything.
Yeah.
Think of it in Christian terms as a garden of Eden if you want.
Yeah.
Plenty of everything. Human beings are grouped into groups. One group is not going to be in conflict with another group because the other group can go, we're going down the road. So
I'm not necessarily convinced by what you've said, but let's just go along with it for a moment, and let's say that you're right. Then that would imply to me that the Genesis narrative is correct. That human beings at one point had a condition in which they were in peace with one another and in peace with the world around them, and then they fell from that status to be in conflict with one another and to be in conflict with the world around them.
This is amazing how Christianity has made its produced and invented its philosophy to actually reflect what actually happened. But instead of actually saying what happened, they say it's God.
But Genesis was written thousands of years ago. If we allow what your presentation, which bearing in mind, I disagreed with your presentation. I disagreed with your presentation. But the point is, but the point is, what you're describing fits with the Genesis narrative.
But that's because that's after the effect, after the effects. Genesis was written after the events, after the fact.
2,000 years ago,
Yes.
describing events that happened how many thousand years before?
13,000, 14,000,
So they're
15,000.
describing something that the highest estimate happened 13,000 years before. Do you think that those people who were writing in the Bronze Age could have captured and had access to information that would have allowed them to describe what you're describing?
Because in the Bronze Age, previous to that,
Right, hold on one second. You've just said that they didn't have access, they didn't have that ability to access that info. So if they didn't have access to it,
Let me explain.
oh, they did.
They did.
So they had access to information that was 12,000 years old. Go on.
Explain.
Yeah.
All of this history and all of this information was handed down hand to mouth, hand to mouth.
Yes,
hand to mouth.
I agree.
No one could write. There was no such thing as
I
written
agree.
word. There was hardly anything as language.
I agree.
So therefore, it was handed down.
Yes.
But then eventually, when there was language and there was written things, then at that point they said, oh, let's write down all the stories we heard from our past generations.
Yeah.
That's what they did.
So what?
And then when they did that,
Yeah.
someone came along and said, oh yes, very well, but what we actually need is a God.
Yeah.
So let's just transfer all the information into the Bible.
Well, the reality is that if I was to take your argument seriously, it would strengthen my faith in the Bible. Because your argument corresponds with the Genesis narrative.
I can't really argue with it because,
Yeah.
because you
But-
believe.
But the Genesis, but what you've just said corresponds to the Genesis narrative.
Mine came before
And
yours.
that-
Mine came first.
based
Yours came
on based on
after.
what a claim.
On human beings' experience.
Your view of history is a very modern one. Yeah, your view of prehistory is a very modern view of prehistory in that you filter God out.
God doesn't come into it.
But that's your assumption.
Well, it's a fact. When
No,
did
I'm
God-
sorry, that's just an assumption.
But when the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. Why
Yeah.
2,000 years ago? Why not before?
Well, no, the Bible was written over a period of over 1,000 years. So it's not 2,000 years ago. Yeah, it's over 1,000 years that the Bible is written. And even though it was written by different authors at different times, in different contexts, in different places, by different people, there's a golden narrative that goes through each of those stories. Well, you're not even listening, are you? There's a golden thread that goes through all of those stories, that teaches what God is doing in history about the redemption of the world from this fall that you've just said archaeology supports, this idea of the fall.
I can't argue with you because you have a faith. I don't.
I think that you need to maybe...
I'll just go with logic and history.
I encourage you to go with the facts.
This is
And the fact is that if what you're saying is true, that corresponds to Genesis. The writers of Genesis had no access to that prehistory, and yet what they are writing about in Genesis poetically matches the reality.
Let's go back to the beginning of this. What was human nature 100 or 200 years ago was different from the human nature now.
No, it's the same.
Wait a minute.
Human nature has not changed.
200 years ago, if someone stole a loaf of bread, he was hanged.
Now we put him in prison.
Don't even do that. But the point is, human nature would never support someone being hanged just from stealing bread. No one in their right mind would support someone being hanged. And yet it was very common in those days to support people being hanged for almost hardly anything.
I think we've got to separate two
So
things.
human nature has changed.
No, it hasn't. There's this myth amongst moderns like yourself that human beings are this blank piece of paper and that society writes on the heart of the human. That's a modern myth in the same way that you are describing the Bible as a myth. That's your myth. Now, the truth is that any observation of human nature universally points out that the human condition is one that's driven by ego, by pride, by selfishness, by lust, by wrath. These are the things that drive us, and that over all recorded history, we find this consistent pattern of human beings pursuing self-interest.
Is it human nature to murder someone?
In self-interest, yeah, it can be.
Can. And how many
No, let's rephrase that. I'm not saying it's human nature to kill someone. I'm saying it's human nature to act in self-interest. And if in the calculus, self-interest is served by killing someone, that can lead people to kill someone.
But the vast majority, 99.9% of the population do not kill people.
But
I don't think you've killed anyone.
but 100% of human beings are self-interested.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're going to kill
Yes.
someone.
Yes. Do you recognise that human beings are self-interested?
No, not self-interested, interested in the community.
No,
The
that's
interests
not
of the
true.
Yes.
That's what we're defining by community there.
Because everyone.
No, that's just utterly, that's observably a false statement. Babies are not born with a sense of community,
They become.
but they are born with a sense of themselves.
That's not other than just present.
But we're talking about human nature, so the way to...
But they're not able to defend.
The best observation of human nature is to look at it in its earliest expression, because that's when it is its purest, when it is unconditioned by other factors. Do you understand the argument? So when we look at a child, a newborn baby doesn't have any sense of anything other than themselves. And they begin from the self and their self-interest and work outwards, which is exactly what we mean by original sin when we say that human beings are born with a bit of code written on their heart and their soul and their mind that says, be self-interested. Now, when it's in a child, it's harmless. It doesn't hurt anyone. It's cute. It's adorable. We actually love them for it because we're programmed to, because it's self-interested to program to. But, well, they are dependent on other people.
They can't survive on their own.
Agreed, but they're self-interested.
No matter how self-interested they are, if you just leave them to be on their own, all right, you get on with it, they die within 24 hours, to probably 48 hours, they die.
Yeah.
Because their self-interest doesn't help them.
There's a cognitive dissonance between what you're willing to observe and what you're willing to call it.
No, but it's a baby, if it's left on its own, will die.
That's a given.
Yeah. So it depends entirely on the other people
That's
around.
also a given, but that takes nothing away from what I just said.
But why are the people around it bothered about the life of the baby?
But what I just said
No, but why are the people around the baby
that's
interested?
irrelevant to the point that I made. No, hold on one second. The point that I made is that if we want to see human nature in its purest form, we have to look at it in its most unsullied form, and its most unsullied form is the form that is prior to any social conditioning. And the reality is that human beings,
But a baby doesn't do any harm.
human beings, and we see this in babies, are self-interested.
But they don't do any harm.
I agree,
So
but they
therefore,
are
at what
self-interested.
point- But at what point does the baby grow up to a point where it doesn't think about itself but thinks about others?
So let me continue
So
my
it's
argument.
changing. Human nature's changing.
Let me continue my argument. Now that we've established that a human being is self-interested, that same self-interest expresses itself every time one human being stabs another human being in the back, every time a human being pursues power for their own benefit, every time... That's the reality that we see all around us.
Distorted what you call self-interest.
That is self-interest.
into something really bad and nasty.
That is self-interest.
So it's in self-interest to kill other people.
It can be.
Right, well,
In the grand calculus,
point
lots of women will kill their babies for self-interest through abortion.
no, they will not kill their baby because the baby's not been born.
Which is, it's still a baby, just because it's not been born.
No, it's not a baby.
Look, let's stick to one
Just a
argument.
little thing that's
Let's stick to one argument. That's a completely irrelevant point to abortion.
It isn't.
It really is.
The reality
It really is.
everyone, including the baby and everyone else, depends entirely on everyone else. We're no man
That's a
is an
given,
island.
but that's irrelevant to the point.
But what point? But that self-interest changes from that point when a baby is self-interest.
Yes.
It changes as the person becomes more mature.
No,
in
the
life.
self-interest. No, hold on. So to go back to my analogy of the blank sheet of paper, right? The one line of code that's written on is be self-interested, but then society comes along to that blank sheet of paper and then writes other things on that blank sheet of paper as well. And so no, it's still there, but there is now other information that is now interacting. If it's properly reinforced, yes. If it's properly reinforced, yes.
A baby with a self-interest, being entirely self-interested, how can it develop as a person into a point where it can still survive entirely on its self-interest?
Are you saying that you don't operate from self-interest?
I operate on interest of myself.
There you
by,
go.
Listen, by associating with other people to protect them.
Great, so that's self-interest.
Yeah, but it's like when Richard Dawkins says it's the selfish gene, people have misinterpreted it. It's actually...
I've not misinterpreted it.
Because you're saying this self-interest is a negative thing.
It is a negative thing. It is a negative thing.
It isn't, because it's converted. It's converted from self-interest into the interest of the community.
But it's not, though. You want to relate to other people because you hope to gain from it. And what I'm saying is that you can't disconnect your actions from their motives. And if you're acting from self-interest, it sullies the sincerity of your action. One of the things that Christianity has to teach someone like you is that, it really does. It really does.
So
is that your motivations are important.
So the motivation.
And that the higher humanity, the new humanity, the higher humanity, is one that acts from a place of selflessness, not self-interest.
Why, as an atheist, do I need to have this propaganda, this pressure from Christians, or Christian or anyone else, to do something which is different from what I'm already doing? Because I'm not doing anything bad. I'm not doing anything bad. You might think so, but I know I'm not. All my life, I've been, I'm interested in eating feeding myself, getting a job, and helping myself into a better situation. But at the same time, most of my life, I've been associating with other people and helping other people.
And these
I
works.
haven't done it because of some God telling me to do it. I do it because I have a basic human instinct to do that.
Yeah, but
so
these.
Therefore, I don't need your God.
Oh, you do.
I don't need your God
You really
to tell
do.
me what to do.
Because.
To fight and kill someone in
Yeah, you
another
really
country.
do.
No,
And I'm going to explain. It's a fair question. I'll give you a fair answer. Because regardless of whether you can see the reality, there will be a day that you stand before the judgment seat of God, and you will give an account for your life. And all of these good works that you're appealing to right now, when you present them before God, they're going to look like filthy rags. They're not going to be worth anything at all.
There is no God.
That's your claim, that's your myth, and you're entitled to
I'm
it.
saying there isn't.
And that's a
You're
myth.
saying this is going to be
That's the modern Epicurean myth. It's the modern Epicurean myth. That's all it is. And there's many good arguments that we can marshal to demonstrate that atheism is an irrational belief. It's an irrational belief.
All right. And not Christianity and God and the ideas.
No, those are not irrational beliefs.
Are they not? Well,
Atheism is an irrational belief.
Where is it? Who is he?
I'll give you an example.
Where is this?
In the church, we have a teaching. Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est. Where there is love, there is God. When you have experienced... No, let me to finish my point. You asked a question. You know, as a gentleman of many years, hopefully you have learnt some manners by now, and that you can practice those manners. So if you ask a question, it's incumbent upon you to listen to the answer. So you have asked the question, where is this God? I am telling you that wherever you have experienced genuine love, whenever you have experienced genuine selflessness, my apologies, you have experienced God at that moment. You have experienced the energy of God in that moment.
Experience another human being.
You've experienced them energized by God.
No. The other human being's an atheist as well.
Does God doesn't operate just through Christians.
Oh, right.
That's not the claim of Christianity. We don't say that the Holy Spirit operates only in the
I
church.
don't normally argue with Christians or the Jews, but I'll just do it today because there's no chance to argue. It's fine.
I would like to give you a gift. No, I would like to give you a gift. What happened to like human interaction and human community? And
Knows what as I do, whatever the gift is, it's quite likely I will throw it away.
would you do that if someone gave you a gift?
If it was a gift if it was a gift that was anything to do with Christianity, I would.
Well, your pride is your own. Anyway, have a good day. Take care. Right. So let's do a basic wrap up. The elderly gentleman comes with the argument that there is no God and that there is no need for God. But when we look at the human condition, when we look at human behavior, we see very clearly that human behavior demonstrates with tons of evidence that humans are operating to a principle that we receive at birth. And that principle is be self-interested. And the gentleman accepts it, even though cognitively he doesn't recognize that he accepts it. Now, yes, that blank sheet of paper still has other things society writes upon it, and those things that are written upon the human heart can transform and can counteract that genetic code that says be self-interested, especially if properly reinforced. But the truth of it is that that coding usually determines what everything else, usually influences and taints and colours everything else that is written by society, because the whole of society has that same code of being self-interested. And this is why we need Christ, because Christ gives us the one corrective that we need to hear. If we look at the human condition and we look at human problems, the things that they all have in common, whether they be our own personal problems or whether they be the problems of a society, is that there is a lack of love, a lack of real human compassion and real human solidarity. And that's why Christ corrects human condition by his own example and by his own teaching. And there are no works that we can appeal to on Judgment Day that will count for anything if we present them without Christ. Only Christ gives our work meaning. And it's only through Christ that our work achieves any value at all. God bless. So,